Okay, this lesson is going to be a little bit different than our previous videos have because I need to give you some background information on JavaScript. So this lesson and the next lesson will be PowerPoints that hit some of the highlights that I want you to understand about the language before we start programming in it, and will allow me to talk over the slides and give you some more examples, kind of like as if we were having a lecture together in the classroom. So the way this works is when I get done talking, there's going to be a little bit of a pause, and what you'll need to do then is click your screen to advance to the next slide. So the first thing we need to talk about is what is JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language that allows you to make your pages a lot more interactive. It lets you take care of some housekeeping things that make your pages more useful for your users. But what it does is it sits on top of HTML and CSS and interacts with those things to allow you to programmatically change or collect information. One of the most common uses of JavaScript is for validating input into forms. It's happened to all of us. You go fill out a form, you miss a field that's required, a message comes up and says, hey, you need to fill this out, or you don't type something in the right format, the date's in the wrong format, for let's say, and you get an error message saying, please fill this out correctly before the form submits. And that was probably one of the most common uses of JavaScript, but there are lots of other things you can do. You can have buttons. When users click buttons, things can change, like the background color. We're going to eventually do things like counting down to sales events. We can have the user be greeted by name, things like that, that we can do really only by having a program run. And one thing I do want to point out, like the slide says, is this is not the same thing as Java. Java is a fully compiled program, meaning that when you program it, you go through a step where it creates an executable form. JavaScript, as we'll see in the next couple of slides, runs a little differently. It is called a scripting language and is not necessarily a full-blown programming language like Java. The only thing they share in common, besides a couple of similarities, is the name Java involved in both. And because it is not a fully compiled language, there are some limitations on what JavaScript can't and cannot do. It was intended from the beginning to be a programming language that added interactivity and a lot of times would run in the browser itself. And so to protect people from having their computers constantly hacked, they put some limitations into JavaScript. For example, when you're programming in JavaScript, generally speaking, you can't open or write files onto the client's computer. Who would go to a web page if every time you went there a program ran that could read any of your files, grab social security number, grab your credit card numbers, whatever, or could write viruses to your computer with ease? And so one of the things that was pretty much eliminated was the ability to write and open files on the computer that's running the program. The exception to that is something called a cookie, and a lot of you have probably heard of cookies in JavaScript, and what that does is it allows you to write and read from a small text file. Since text doesn't execute, it is not really a security problem, and it is only limited to being able to read that one type of cookie file. And what this is used for is to store information about your user and then to utilize that later. So an example might be that if you visit Amazon's website, they will probably put a cookie on your machine that maybe puts your customer identification number on it. And that number is stored in their database along with a lot of information about you. So the next time you visit Amazon, the browser reads that file. Amazon knows the number of the customer visiting. They go look it up in their database, and then they retrieve all the information about you that they have, and they can customize the experience for you. So they can say, hey Leah, welcome back to Amazon. Last time you bought this and that and this, so you also might be interested in this and that. And so it's a very powerful thing. It's a little bit beyond where we're going to be in this class, but it is something that's used very commonly with JavaScript. All right, so one thing you need to know about JavaScript is, and programming languages for the web in general, is the concept of what's client side versus server side, because this can give you different answers depending on what you're doing. And so when you say client side, it means that it runs on the person's machine who's requesting the page, and in our case it means that it runs in the browser. So it runs, the program itself is downloaded along with the HTML and the CSS, and the browser itself actually executes the statements of the programming language and provides the output. And that's a very common use, and what we'll be doing mostly in this class is client-side scripting. Server-side scripting means that there is a JavaScript written and it's stored on the server, and so when your browser makes a request to the HTML page, what it'll do is it'll execute that JavaScript on the server and then write the HTML and send that off to the browser that was requesting it. So if the code runs in the client, aka the browser, it's going to be called client side, and if it runs on the server before it's downloaded to the client, then it's server side. The difference between these two really has to be with what the resources are being used. Let me give you an example that might illustrate it a little bit better. Let's say that you had a JavaScript that said today's date is, and then it filled in the date. If you ran that script in the browser, what happens is the browser checks the local machine, it grabs the date and time, and would display that current date and time. So if I'm sitting here in Stephenville and I run something in my browser, it will give me local Stephenville time and date. However, if I request a page that has a server-side JavaScript that does the same thing, let's say that I contact or I request a page from Yahoo, which is out in California. When I did that, it would say the current time is, and it would fill in California's date and time because it would retrieve that information from the server before it's sent down. And so that's kind of an example of how it could be different. But like I said, most of the time we're going to be doing client-side scripting, meaning it'll run here in the browser. Now, some of the things you need to know about JavaScript is the code actually, if it runs on the client side, that means it's going to be part of the HTML document. So it is going to be open to viewing by reading the code in the browser. If you go into any web page and right click and choose View Page Source, not only are you going to see all the HTML and CSS for that page, but if it's client-side JavaScript, you'll also see that. And so there can be some copyright maybe, or some security issues that you would want to pay attention to. Finally, in this slide, this is a pretty short lesson. I'll catch up more in the next one. But the last slide, we're going to talk about where does the JavaScript go. We haven't really covered how we write it yet, but I do want to introduce the new tag that is going to be the script tag. Now, the JavaScript can go into the body section or it can go into the head section. A lot of times it's going to depend on where you want it to execute. But the script tag has an opening and closing tag, just like you've seen before with every other HTML tag we've dealt with. There is an attribute that says type equals text slash JavaScript, and the reason you have that attribute is because there are other scripting languages. VB script is something that Microsoft invented that's not as popular, but it still exists out there. And so this just lets the browser kind of know what kind of code to expect. So anything between the opening and closing script tag is where your code's going to go, and that's actually code that's going to execute instead of show up on the screen. Now, when that script tag shows up, that's when the browser is going to execute it. We'll learn later on how to delay that, but for now, if you put your script in the head section of the document, that means when the page loads, it's going to go through it line by line like it normally does. It's going to hit that script tag in the head section and it's going to execute the script. The same happens is if the script tag appears halfway through the body, if you have some H1s and some paragraphs above it, and then you have a script tag, then the JavaScript will execute and put the output there in the body where you requested it. And that's very important because later on we'll be doing some things where you can have random quotes show up on your page, or like I mentioned earlier, a countdown to an event. You would then put that code in the body where you actually want the output or the statement that says, hey, sale ends in whatever, or actually insert your quote. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this lesson up. In the next lesson, we're going to get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of the language and start talking about some of the things that we can do with it.